All right. Well, I'm going to get started with the introduction and then I'll turn things over to our panelists that we're really excited to have today. So my name is Vanessa Mason. I'm a research director at Institute for the Future, working on IFTF Vantage, our organizational partnership program. And I'm excited to be here today with Rachel Alexander Halsema from the World Bank Group. And this is another edition of Foresight Talks. And if you're curious about what Foresight Talks are, these are open webinars that we hold really to show and help build foresight capacity across our entire IFTF community with sharing mutual learning and better awareness of what needs are across the community. And if you're curious about what some of these resources are, IFTF offers a number of different trainings. We have a few coming up soon, one in DC in March, in Munich, Germany in May. We have our design futures training that will be in April this year in Palo Alto. And then if you're not already familiar, we have a futures thinking course specialization on Coursera that consists of 5 courses that is free or a small nominal cost if you would like to get the certification. And we also offer a number of different online meetups and IFTF newsletters that you can subscribe to on iftf.org. So just to let you know how the Zoom works, of course, some of you are already using the chat already. So again, please feel free to continue doing that. Just so you also know, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So please use that to add questions as well. We'll have Q&A at the end. And right now, everyone is automatically muted. Your videos are turned off. So just so you know about that as well. So use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and you can also use that to upvote questions as well. So quick agenda today, I'm doing the welcome right now, and then I'm going to turn things over to Rachel so she can tell us a little bit more about her work with the World Bank Group, and then we'll have a moderated discussion and then a short Q&A at the end. So with that, I just want to turn things over to Rachel, and Rachel, please feel free to tell us more about your work. Looks like we've lost sound for you again.
Great. I think you guys can probably hear me now. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to be sharing a short presentation with you today. So once we have stopped sharing, I will bring this up. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. All right. So I want to start by giving a short disclaimer, because every good Foresight talk should start with a disclaimer, which is that the views and opinions that I'm about to express here today do not necessarily represent those of the organization that I work for or the member countries that are part of the World Bank. So I work in a lab. We are a little bit of a different organization within a multilateral institution, and we operate a little bit differently, which is why I'm here today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we do, our context, and what our goal is, essentially. We do have, I think, a number of people on the talk today who are actually from our lab or from the World Bank, and I just want to acknowledge that they're there. I think that Seema Angiras from my team is probably here, and I also saw that Julia, who also works with us in ITS, Information and Technology Solutions, is part of the webinar. So I just want to acknowledge and welcome my colleagues. If there's anything that I say that you disagree with, feel free to share it in the web chat. In full transparency, it would be great to have some real-time feedback on how we're doing. So with that, I'll start off. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what we do and how we started. So the Technology and Innovation Lab at the World Bank Group sits within a vice presidency called Information and Technology Solutions. So that's many different acronyms strung together. But in essence, we are the IT function within the World Bank Group. And we are here to serve staff around the world in over 130 different country offices with their daily IT needs. We are effectively the back office. However, because we operate on technology, we get exposed a lot to ideas and concepts in the digital space that are of relevance for our client countries. And a few years ago, we had a request from a number of different parts of the World Bank Group to start looking at two different technologies, or two different sets of technologies, in our overarching umbrella called Distributed Ledger Technologies, DLT, and more narrowly at a specific technology called blockchain. If you ask me to explain blockchain, there's a very good University of Cambridge paper that explains how people are thinking about that technology and defining it. The simplest way to explain it is a blockchain is a chain of blocks. But it has been said that this is a new sort of distributed architecture that may impact the way our financial markets are structured from a technological point of view. It has certainly shown promise in the capital market space. So since 2017, our lab has been looking at creating practical examples for World Bank Group staff so they can understand what this technology does in a specific development context. Shortly after we launched our lab, we were asked to start looking at artificial intelligence and also IoT, Internet of Things. So these are two technologies that are frequently hyped in the news. AI is a very broad space, and it encompasses a very different set of maturity levels in terms of things that are ready to adopt today, like natural language understanding and natural language processing, and things that are a little bit further out, like artificial general intelligence. In terms of IoT, we're seeing just an absolute huge increase in the number of devices that are operating and the number of sensors that are present in our daily lives, and the amount of data they are creating gives us new information, but also new challenges. And we, as a lab, are intending to explore those at different areas. We also introduced augmented reality, virtual reality into our portfolio, as well as 3D printing. So if you ever visit us in Washington, D.C., we have 2 3D printers that we use to model different ideas. We've used them to print awards as a simpler exercise for awarding people for winning our hackathons, but we also look at how that might change the nature of manufacturing. So if you're thinking about agriculture, where you buy a very expensive piece of machinery and one part breaks, what can 3D printing do to help close that gap for a farmer? Or if you think about a country that has a very high level of imports, that is in a remote location, how might 3D printing transform the way they import and export specific items or goods? Finally, starting within the past 6 months, we've been looking at quantum communications and computing, 5G and security. So quantum is an emerging area. For those of you who have physics backgrounds, it is still in the academic space. However, a number of governments and a number of governmental organizations have been looking at quantum in terms of how it will change our decisions about long-term technological architecture. And we'll get to the foresight part soon, but this is just context on what sort of technologies we're interested in terms of how they're going to impact our business as the World Bank Group, operating in many different countries, and our clients who are facing challenges that may be solved by these technologies or may face complexities because these new technologies are introduced. To put this in context, the World Bank Group has a disruptive technologies agenda. So we are looking to do a few things. One is to build these building blocks of technology-led economies, to boost the capacity of people, to improve human capital around technology adoption, and finally to broker, to figure out how to combine technology, data, and expertise to address development challenges. That's at a very high level what the World Bank Group is doing. And within that, we are focusing specifically on developing the digital skills of our staff. So what are some of the sectors, themes, emerging technologies we've looked at? We've already sort of talked about the bottom left-hand quadrant. Some of the sectors we've looked at are education. How would you be able to incentivize youth to experience education in a different way so that they are incentivized, rewarded, motivated to participate in an educational system that may not always recognize their style of learning? So for example, if you look up Project Evoke, that's one of the projects that we've been involved with from a blockchain perspective. Health, how do we solve problems around results-based financing? So every year the World Bank goes out and it tries to pay health facilities for achieving certain targets around indicators. How many people have been vaccinated? How many patients that meet a specific criteria have been met? And there's always this challenge between a person actually receiving the health service and us being able to pay them. And that information gap is a problem that technology may be able to solve, but there's a very human element to it. And there's also a lot of questions around security. So we've been looking at this in the context of how to reduce the time lag between when we get the data about somebody having received some sort of medical service and actually making the payment. On the climate area, we just finished a simulation this fall around how you might create a different architecture for climate markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreements. In agriculture, we have looked at, we've worked with the private sector to understand what solutions might exist for example, doing soil testing and using IoT sensors. Also looking at the challenges of implementing technology in a sector that in many countries has historically been untechnologized, to use a completely made up word. But there hasn't been a lot of technological penetration in agriculture in certain areas. So the question really there is, what are the preconditions to make people's lives easier? And where is the direction going in agriculture where technology could be helpful? So for example, we say drones might be helpful, but if we go to the lab, what practical experiments give us some evidence, some indication that those are actually going to solve some problems? We've also looked at energy and mining, land, insurance, and financial inclusion. We spent a lot of time when our lab first started looking at the challenge of de-risking. So individuals being cut out of the international financial markets because they could not be verified. So for example, people would not be able to send remittances back home because the bank would not know who they were. So was there some way that we could get information or data either about them or about their transactions that would be able to lower the bar for them to be re-included in the financial system? We've looked at supply chains, we've looked at tokenization, we've looked at identity, and finally we've looked at operational efficiency. So what of these technologies are actually going to help us as an institution be more ready for the future? And a lot of that comes back to using data better, using cybersecurity better, understanding how IoT can help us instead of make life more complicated. And then finally, figuring out where artificial intelligence can help us automate repetitive tasks or suggest patterns or find insights for us. Our clients are the World Bank Group Global Practices and Internal Operations. So we work with the World Bank Group, different entities. So we're an umbrella. The World Bank Group is an umbrella, and within that there are 5 different organizations, one of which is the World Bank, the other one of which is the IFC, and there's 3 others under that umbrella. But we primarily work with the World Bank and IFC staff who are interested to learn about these new technologies and come into the lab, learn a little, get their hands on the technology, maybe build some practical examples. So our current priorities have been, as I mentioned, the hands-on experimentation. 2, looking at how we can do field testing or validation. So we sit in, our lab is primarily based in Washington, D.C. Regardless of how many good ideas that we have here, there's always a different reality in the countries that we are working in and information that we may not have access to or remember or think about when we are in the lab. And that's why this testing component, this feedback component is so important, of saying, how do we, if we have a good idea, or somebody has brought us a good idea from a different context, wherever they are in the world, how do we ensure that we get enough information about how it works in real life so that we can, hello. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, how can we get enough information so that we could actually take it forward? So we just completed a field test in a Francophone country around results-based financing, and one of the things that our team remembered when they were working on that specific field test was the energy grid in the country that they were working with is not always stable. So when you're talking about introducing technology to solve a development problem, what are the assumptions you need to make about how that technology is used so that when you go out, it still works if the energy grid goes offline? We are also looking at design thinking and foresight. This is part of our larger tool set of facilitation and sense-making techniques that we use both to get closer to the customer and develop empathy around problems we're trying to solve, and also to put things in context. So we are at the very beginning of our journey with foresight. One of our recognitions so far is that when people say the word foresight, especially at this institution, everybody takes a different meaning from that word. So even if you explain, this is about creating potential plausible futures and thinking those out through potentially some lightweight experiments, people still have a little bit of trouble understanding exactly what the process looks like. And this is where the learning by doing part comes in, of saying, how do we actually use these tool sets? What value do they bring? And from an organizational context, what do people relate to the most? And I'll come back to that with respect to the tool set. And then finally, figuring out how to de-risk the adoption of emerging transformative technologies. And I would say this sounds very high level. In essence, what this is creating enough critical mass of knowledge within the people who are actually going to take these technologies and solutions forward, so they know what are the challenges, the obstacles, the preconditions to be fully informed, so that we're not just reading about AI in the newspaper. We have a good sense of what type of AI we're using, what data is required, how to create a data architecture that supports an AI-ready business or business model. So that really comes down to the people aspect. So now I'm going to turn a little bit and talk about how we're using foresight. So as a lab, we started very early talking about design thinking. And that was primarily because we had a lot of instances where people would bring us a technology, but there wouldn't be an anchor for it in a person or in an experience. And design thinking, in my view, the way I have understood it through the UK Design Council and the way that it has brought benefit to my work within the lab, has been to understand that empathy component of putting yourself in a different context, of gathering information that helps you orient what you're building or testing to a different way of thinking, to a different mindset. And that can be very hard to do because there's a lot of bias involved, especially when it comes to technology. Technology can be extremely biased. A couple of years ago, just anecdotally, we had someone come to us from MIT. Her name was, and with apologies for her pronouncing her name, but I believe her name was Joy Walamwini. And she talked about how she had done this exercise with 3 different facial recognition platforms to see whether they would be able to recognize her. And facial recognition is a very controversial topic. And she said one of the challenges is that the algorithms that she was testing, which were from 3 leading companies, they had not been tested on people that looked like her. And so the algorithms sometimes did not recognize her gender. They didn't recognize she was a woman. And they had trouble recognizing elements of her face because she was a woman of color. And so if you think about empathy, if you think about different contexts and technology, the training set, the people who create the technology, they can introduce a lot of bias into it. And so that this element of empathy through design thinking, through prototyping, through testing becomes very important. We introduced foresight into our toolkit earlier this year because we wanted to see a longer view. And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do foresight. I did some digging within the World Bank's internal repositories to see whether people had done something similar before. And there are many reports out there that we've issued that give this long-term view. One of the most recent examples is that we issued a report on Pakistan in 2047. And it talks about what the trends are in the country, what are going to be the pressures on different areas, and what are some potential opportunities that the country can take advantage of. And that's from a very different perspective than we would come from. We're looking specifically at the technology. There was a different report, which I can no longer find, it may have been taken down, that was issued out of Finland, where they looked at a whole host of different technologies, and they said, we don't know how these are going to evolve, but we have a clear sense that these are going to be relevant for our society and for our citizens. How do we get a handle on what the potential impacts could be? Because these technologies could evolve and they could be shaped differently. So those are sort of some inspirations that we have taken. In terms of what we are doing in our lab, we've taken a few pieces of the IFTF Foresight Toolkit, and we've been testing them as part of workshops. So we're a demand-driven lab. People will come to us and say, I want to use a technology to solve this specific problem, right? So they might come to us and say, I have a social protection challenge, and I want to figure out if there's a way to improve the coaching aspect of social protection in this specific country context. We might use a little bit of design thinking for the research phase, and then we might use a little bit of foresight to figure out, well, you came to us with this specific request. What makes you think that after so many years of doing coaching a certain way, there is now an inflection point where the introduction of technology might have a better chance of uptake? And that question is a pretty good fit for foresight, because there's a number of tools. I'm thinking of the toolkit where you have look back to look forward, drivers of change, signals of change, and these can be helpful to eliciting a little bit of the substance of how people arrived at the challenge of trying to use technology for a specific problem. So say, for example, they were on Twitter because all of these citizens all over the world are now connected through this platform, which gives this amazing transparency. I was in a meeting the other day where somebody said, you know, our job is fundamentally different with the internet, because everybody can see with the internet, because everybody can see everything, and you can discover information that was previously undiscoverable. We had some people come to us from the GDELT project, which I think is associated with Google, but they were talking about discovering insights and sentiments from news all over the world. So we're seeing not only information being available, but it's now accessible in languages and cultures, across languages and cultures, in a way that has previously not before been possible. And if we think about, you know, that short-term, long-term vision, there are many different directions it can go. So we've been using these parts of the toolkit to figure out how to contextualize our problem statements for introducing technology. A couple of the challenges that have come up. One is, it really matters who you have in the room. So this was a point that was brought up to us by one of our colleagues from Japan, and he said that in Japan, foresight typically it's a very rigorous process, and it takes a while, and you need top-notch experts who really know what they're talking about to address a specific challenge area. And there are many smart people working at the World Bank Group, but it's a question of figuring out what mix of people, both in terms of their perspectives and their tool sets and their knowledge sets and mindsets, need to be in the room to really make that facilitation work. The flip side of that is that the facilitator of the foresight exercise also needs to be very well informed, needs to be able to navigate the different areas that are being discussed. Otherwise, the result becomes very superficial. And the challenge with a result that's very superficial is people think the tool is somehow to blame. And in some cases, the tool may not be a fit for the conversation that needs to be had. But it is very important to get that diversity of mindsets, that diversity of experiences when you're thinking about doing some of these exercises where you're saying, what's the future of a large area? Because how are you going to create a subset, a representative subset that actually matters and can create that conversation that you're looking for to frame a technology experiment? So those are some of the things we've done. We are constantly learning from other groups. I know that there's a lot of different governments that are thinking about foresight in different ways. I was reading last night a paper that was done in South Africa, where they talked about a long-term vision from the perspective of song and dance, and it was a different way of approaching the question of foresight. Some people might say, the only way you can predict the future is through economic indicators, and this was a little bit different. This was a little bit more of a cultural approach, which may relate to people in a different way. We've also seen examples of foresight. I think I may be mistaken, but I think Uruguay has a 2050 foresight strategy where they're talking about integrating women into the workforce better and leveraging women as part of society better. So these are some examples that we can look to for inspiration to say, what are our client countries thinking about in terms of the long-term vision of where they want to be? And then how does technology fit into that? And then separately, if we think about these technologies that are emerging, that people don't really have their hands on yet, like quantum, how might that impact the way that we think about all of these interconnected technologies? So people have talked about how 5G is going to introduce much lower latency than we have today. It's also going to support a different level of IoT, and that might enable smart cities and smart villages, but it also may enable a world in which cybersecurity is a very relevant daily challenge. So what is the interplay between those three things? And if we think about the Foresight Toolkit, that might help us do some experimentation around, okay, so if we have this increased computing power and we have these networks that can now support things like remote surgery, what does that do to a healthcare function? And what skills would you need if you were working in that healthcare function? Is this something that you, as an individual, need to understand at a detailed level? What is the entry point for people to understand this new reality? And I just pick healthcare as an example because I was reading about a project where this major city that is a hub for many different hospitals was trying to do something simple like replace its system for supporting doctors and capturing information about their interactions with patients using traditional technologies, conventional proven technologies, and it was a very big challenge. And that human element of transitioning to a more digitized world is not easy, and it requires a lot of human participation, and it can frequently take over a person's daily job. So these are all considerations for how the technology that we're looking at might fit with a foresight approach. With that, I'd like to actually turn the conversation to a Q&A because I know we have a lot of interesting people on the line. I was looking at some of your descriptions yesterday, so I'd like to turn it to maybe a Q&A at this point. I'll let Vanessa tell me how she wants to run it, but it might be more interesting to do a little bit of back and forth.
Sure. Thank you for that really thorough introduction, Rachel. It's really hearing just about just the breadth of work that the World Bank is doing, and then also knowing that you're serving so many different member countries as well. And so let's see, I'm taking a look at the questions here. But I think maybe wanted to start things off, like knowing that you guys are the IT group, and you mentioned that you're looking at technologies that can either support other countries in specific areas that they're looking to grow in or that they may be disrupted by. And then I know when you and I spoke, we were curious about distinguishing between disruptions and then technologies. So can you maybe go into, when you think about your work, how you think about those two areas differently? Like what is the difference between a disruption versus a technology?
So the word disruption is interesting. I know that before we had this webinar, we talked a little bit about our experience here in the lab, where people have started to sort of steer away from the word disruptive technologies because it can be a little misleading, right? It's this idea that all of a sudden you introduce a new technological business model that will change everything. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that there's many areas where technology is incremental and disruption may not happen all at once for all people using the technology. So, for example, even 5G, it's been very well adopted in a couple of countries. Korea is one of the leaders in 5G. So you could say 5G will change everything, but for that specific country context. Elsewhere, where people are still thinking about how to implement it, people are still looking at the security standards around it and how to meet that new challenge of implementing security in 5G. It may take a little bit longer, and it may not be quite as disruptive, big bang as advertised. So that would be how I would address that one.
Okay. And then we've got a few questions from people, again, kind of on this idea of like, what does foresight look to different audiences and how it affects how they practice? So maybe share a couple of different stories about how you've seen foresight look maybe in one country versus another, as they've started to do that.
So in terms of our lab, since we're not on the front line, we are not having those daily conversations with client countries about what their foresight might look like. But in terms of specific technologies, some of the areas that we've looked at in terms of how you might use foresight, one of them is around normative foresight. So how do you ensure that technology develops in a way that is in accordance with our laws and standards and norms? So you're sort of changing the narrative from technology is happening everywhere and everybody needs to use it and adopt it right now, and this new technology came out, and if you're not a first mover, you're all of a sudden behind, to a conversation about, well, what are the laws and norms that we want to preserve within our society, and how does technology enable that, and how can we shape it in a way that it supports a country's preferred development path? And that's interesting because we see it in our use cases of, we wouldn't want to necessarily just take something off the shelf. We want something that's a little bit custom. So that's where the prototyping comes in.
Okay, great. Do you have an example of maybe that, about that prototyping process? Like how did folks move from, shaping a problem statement to then moving into that prototyping process?
Sure. So let's just take, what example can we take? We could take the remittance transaction repository. So when we first started our lab, we had a bunch of people who signed up to be blockchain developers, and we asked a commercial organization that had a blockchain team how they did it, and they said you couldn't really hire these people; you had to grow them. Right? This is a new technology. There's some investment that needs to be made in training and opportunity and development of people to be able to get to a point where you can actually prototype something using this new technology. New set of tools. The tools weren't very user-friendly. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning, the prototyping was very difficult because we said, how do we prototype? We don't even know how to prototype. So a lot of effort was spent in engaging with the private sector, engaging with leading technology partners, engaging with academic institutions to understand how we get up and running. And that's, if we come back to using the Foresight Toolkit in a way that actually delivers value, that gets back to who you have in the room and who's giving you the information to help you shape those experiments in a way that matters. So we started out with a very simple prototype around land management. And then as people got up and running, we were able to do those a little bit more efficiently. And we're constantly playing with new technologies. With quantum, it's going to be a really interesting question because there are some commercial organizations out there that have made tool sets available for you to experiment with quantum algorithms. But quantum computing itself is very expensive because there's a lot of infrastructure around it, and you can't just access it very easily. So one of our questions will be looking forward. So if you say in 2030 quantum is going to be introduced into the mainstream, right? It's not ready right now. It's part of academic institutions. It's in R&D phase at all of these large tech companies. But in 2030, it's going to be ready. How do we prepare people for that? What skills can we start thinking about now? There was a paper that came out this December that talked about quantum algorithms and the quantum computing stack, and how people can start thinking about getting involved with that. And so that gets back to the education component that we do.
Okay, great. And of course, you're the World Bank, so a lot of your work is directly touching upon more human areas like education, agriculture, and health. And so how does that sort of human-centered and human-driven part of your work, how does that affect how you practice foresight when you think about adopting these tools and structuring those experiments, and how does that vary across countries?
I would say one of my biggest learnings from working in our lab, so we have people from all over the world working in our lab. We have people from Turkey, China, developed countries like the US, Japan, Korea, people from, one woman from Cameroon. So it's a very diverse set of people. And it was funny because we did this little exercise the other day that was a little bit of an icebreaker, where we used something called Method Kit. I think Method Kit is a series of cards just for brainstorming. I believe they're made in Sweden. But the idea was we put all of these different Method Kit cards on the table. Some of them represented global trends, some of them represented personas or famous people, and some of them represented new technologies or capabilities. And we asked the group to pull up one of each card and explain why they picked those three cards and why they could relate to them. And the perspectives that people brought were so different. And that's sort of, I would say, when you're using something like a Foresight toolkit, I would expect that if you're really using it in an international context with people who come from very different environments, you can't make that many assumptions about what outputs you're going to get or how people are going to be open to it, right? So there's a little bit of getting to know you to be able to leverage these sort of tool sets, and making sure that you have that diverse perspective represented. I would say that after that exercise using Method Kit, I'm completely aware of how little that I appreciate the diversity of this institution. There's so many different perspectives here, and that's because we hire from all over the world. But when you think about facilitating a workshop where you're addressing a specific problem, there's another cultural aspect, which is when you do these exercises of brainstorming, you might have people from cultures that are very comfortable with putting their ideas out there, with making direct statements with each other, with building off of each other's ideas. You may have other cultures that require a little bit more of internal synthesis or consensus, or people feel like they should be directly asked for their opinion before giving it. And that's something that we need to be mindful of in our facilitation exercises, is that people engage in very different ways, and there's not one recipe to do that. And one of the ways you can reduce that risk is by having people in your team that are from different places, that are familiar with different methods of communication across cultures.
Sure. I love that recognition that people engage in different ways. And so that's the perspective they're bringing to futures as well. Let's see, maybe one last question. You've highlighted a lot, like this focus that you guys placed on testing and feedback, and really, especially in the sort of the goal, I think you spoke about, like trying to de-risk a number of these technologies. And like, what would you say when you think about your foresight work? What's your sort of approach or philosophy for iteration as you think about moving through the Foresight Inside Action cycle? How are you thinking about iteration in that sense?
So right now, just personally, my learning process has been to use parts of the toolkit on different groups of people and see what the reaction is. Okay. Or even just have a conversation with people saying, we're doing Foresight. Is that something that interests you? And see the reaction. So somebody the other day said, I don't understand what that is. Can you explain it to me? And then I did, and she said, is it kind of like stress testing, where you're trying to assess whether the bank has the capital requirements to withstand a financial crisis? Mm-hmm. Because I know about stress testing. And I don't know about stress testing. I have no idea what stress testing involves. But it's sort of, it people learn frequently through analogies. So it's sort of interesting to put the word out there and see what assumptions, what thoughts they have about it. Yes, that's been a process. So by testing it on different groups, we've gotten feedback about what works, what doesn't. We did a workshop the other day where we had a specific challenge around how do you introduce automation or intelligence or more correlative data into the process of managing legal compliance. And we tried to use the Foresight Toolkit for looking back to look forward. And we said, here's the problem space. You can look back to look forward since, I think we said 2000, beginning of the 2000s. And you're welcome to use any information from any part of the world. And they said, well, that's too broad. And that's good feedback, right? Because you don't want to boil the ocean with a foresight exercise. No one ever leaves the room. So they said it would be more useful to us if you constrained the foresight exercise to just our organization. So if you said, what are the specific changes that are impacting our organization around legal compliance that have caused us to think about technology's intervention differently? And what are the tool sets that are now available that weren't available 10 years ago that we think will change the direction of how we do our work? And that, I think, is a little bit more concrete, and people can relate to that a little bit better. Okay. So that I think is some of the learning that we're getting from doing these foresight exercises in pieces.
Yeah, that's great. Like testing with different audiences, seeing analogies, understanding what constraints that actually make sense. There's a tension there. And so we have, just to shift to audience Q&A, speaking of tensions, one of the questions that someone had was what percentage of your time is spent on research and what percentage is spent on more hands-on experiments and field tests? So how do you strike a balance between thinking and studying and sharing and then taking that out and taking action?
If I had my way, I would spend much more time on research.
Interesting. Why is that?
So I was listening to an interview the other day with somebody who was previously in government and then she left, and she said, being in public service is not the time to do research because so much of your day might be consumed by just meeting people and staying current. And when you're out of public service, when you're away from if I could use a word, again, this disclaimer, this is not the words of my organization, but when you're away from the center of action or the bureaucracy, you might have time to pause and reflect. So I would say that at some point I will have that time to pause and reflect. In the interim, we use virtual channels to try to stay updated with each other, but we have people within our team who have spent a lot of their day scanning the environment, looking for information, for reports, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think one of the learnings that I have gained over the past couple of years is that because everybody has access to the same information, it's probably true that if you have found a problem that you want to solve with technology, somebody is also probably looking at that as well and may have already done something that you can take advantage of. So the challenge then becomes, how do you build on what they're doing as opposed to just recreating what they're doing? And when it comes to foresight, that is also an interesting challenge. So if you're saying foresight for a specific area, is there something that you can build on? Is there a resource that you can look at? So I would actually turn the question around to you, would be how, if there are foresight exercises that are occurring where material may be created that people can take advantage of, where can we look for that information?
Sure, that's an excellent question. And it's certainly one that someone else had too, like where can we find this information so we can build on that? I think probably as you find too, that a lot of your staff ends up doing a lot of time like combing and scanning. We certainly do that at IFTF too. But I think in the spirit of sharing, a lot of our research is public. I'm sure a lot of you guys try to share things publicly as much as possible too. And then having spaces like whether it's Foresight Essentials training for people to come together and then upskill and having an alumni community. I work on our IFTF Vantage program, which is for organizations of which the World Bank is a part of. So having that space where our partners are able to come together and learn from each other, able to engage with our research that comes out in every year. You know, last year our research was around power and how that's shifting across the world. This year, it's focused on organizations and what makes organizations future ready. So having those spaces for community where people can learn from each other, able to gain expertise, able to share like what they've tested, what they're learning about is pivotal for people to be to learn and build rather than recreating the wheel. So I would say, you know, having that community, having access to expertise, having access to that research, and then, you know, carving out spaces where, like you're saying, where you can actually have those reflective conversations. So even, you know, a lot with both in Foresight Essentials and in IFTF Vantage, we tell people, even if you can do a bit of signal scanning, you know, set aside 15 minutes a week just to look for signals. And then maybe with your monthly lunch and learn or at your staff meeting, have that as an opportunity to carve out a little bit of time for signal sharing so that people get in the habit of sharing things that they're seeing, the experiments that they've come across, so that there's some level of knowledge exchange that you can build at an organizational level. So I think those sort of time and sort of physical or virtual space, depending on if you're a distributed team, that's where we see this kind of growth happening and building. So we've got a question around maybe when you think about emerging technologies, what are some of the biggest dangers that you see with some of the emerging technologies that you're researching or that are on your radar for the World Bank that you're cautious of?
So in terms of what I have been hearing, I have been hearing that there is a potential digital divide that is occurring between groups that have access to technology and have this sort of advantage because they are already immersed in it, and groups that don't have an on-ramp yet or may not have sufficient human capital to be able to take advantage of these new technologies. And I think that question of human capital of skills is probably the biggest danger, is that some people will be creating the technology and sharing it and monetizing it and making it available, and others will not necessarily be in that same position of being able to take advantage of it, either because they don't know how it works or they may not know enough about it to know the pros and cons.
Okay.
So for example, some major connectivity infrastructure is introduced and there is insufficient human capital to be able to understand that security standards were optional and they were not implemented. And what are the implications for all of the traffic that's going across that network? Yes. So, you know, there's some basic questions when it comes to access to technology, but I think that the skills element is probably the biggest danger. There's other ones that you can talk about, like bias that we already mentioned, or unintended use, unintended consequences of design is something that comes up a lot during design thinking of, oh, I built this thing that I thought was going to be great, and I built empathy with this person that or this persona that I invented or was able to piece together, and then whatever I prototyped is actually not going to be useful for reasons that I couldn't envision. And that's where testing comes in.
Sure. And so in that vein, how much of what the lab does is around education or maybe informing stakeholders to address that digital divide or that human capital sort of differences that you might see in some of your countries?
So I think a lot of what we do is to create examples that people can relate to in their own context. So for example, if you're able to show somebody in their day-to-day operations how a specific capability within AI is actually useful and not just some general thing that people are tossing around as an efficiency gain, then that becomes a communication vehicle for you to be able to have a deeper conversation about the capabilities to transform someone's business. So I would say those practical examples are a foothold in how we do that learning. We also, when we started the lab, we focused very heavily on our IT staff, and we're going to refresh that this spring when we looked at how to create a lab around some of these newer technologies where we can create some opportunities for people to learn in a hands-on way. So building the skills through our own IT department.
Okay. Great. Let's see. It's a lot of questions I'm trying to look through. I think maybe when you think about, I know you've highlighted 4 areas of emerging technologies that you're focused on right now. How do you track new developments in that? Like, what are your sort of internal practices, and what do you think works well for those, or that you would try to shift?
So since we are demand driven, part of it is a staff member from the World Bank Group might come to us and say, I met this really interesting company working in, for example, Singapore. Do you know anything about this technology that they're working on in this specific context? Or someone might say, you know, I have this specific sticky problem, and I have heard about this thing called drones for blood delivery in the area of remote health medicine. And I think that might be something that we want to explore. So part of it is just listening to our own staff, because we're so distributed all around the world that we end up meeting different groups, whether that be governments or the private sector or academics. Another area is trying to stay tapped into these different universities that are doing leading research on these new technologies and the potential for development impact. So I've mentioned a few of the ones in the US. There's universities all over the world. And it's funny because some of these things we find out after they've happened. So for example, there was a deep learning in Daba at Kenyatta University that looked really interesting, but we didn't find out about it until afterwards, or I didn't. But part of that is, you know, we need to also make sure that we're using our own staff around the world effectively. And that actually is a bigger challenge of how do you stay connected with each other on these topics. So you've sort of mentioned about, you know, meeting up with people. There's also a challenge around keeping communications light. So sending somebody a link to an article, I get maybe 50 of those a day. So how do you actually synthesize information for people that you're trying to share knowledge with in a very short way so that they understand why you think that article is interesting, or why you think that is a signal or message that people need to listen to?
Okay. Yes, definitely information synthesis. So one of the ways, at least we do that at IFTF, we have a weekly newsletter that we send out. So there's a few signals, and then we're always sharing both the what of the signal as well as the so what for that as well. So that's one way to think about doing it. But I do hear you that that's difficult to do, especially when you're distributed. Let's see. And then I know we've only got like a couple minutes left. Oh, did you want to say something?
Can I ask a question to the audience? I'd be interested in any suggestions that people have, or any thoughts that people have on things we should explore, or maybe some feedback for us on what you've heard today as our future direction.
Yeah, we'll see if like folks add things in chat. We've got like some specific questions around curiosity around quantum computing, blockchain and tokenization. And then let's see. There was one question around where you see foresight in capital markets, but I'm not sure how much you guys play in that space.
So I know that there's been a lot of work done with the World Economic Forum in terms of the future of finance. I know that our colleagues in the Finance Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice, as part of the Bali FinTech agenda, are looking at how the future of money might change. And a lot of that is around digital payments, mobile access, and also the efforts by central banks all over the world to consider faster payments and the mechanism for faster payments, whether that be central bank issued digital currencies, which are very challenging in terms of how you actually architect and build those, and other approaches, like just making sure that everything is more transparent by upgrading the standards for interoperability. payments. So there's lots of discussions happening around the future of money and finance. I would stay tuned for that, but there are already a number of resources out there that are very interesting to review.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe just to close things up, I know that you said you're very demand driven. So where do you see maybe the next area of either potential demand, or where do you see demand shifting, and what your customers are asking of you to look at?
I would say based on our what I've been hearing within the institution, the demand really is driven by countries and regions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say it will be increasingly important for us to keep a very close eye on what kind of conversations, what type of hackathons, what types of technical activities are happening in our client and member countries, and how people are thinking about technology and engaging with it. So the next big thing is in our client countries, basically.
All right, stay tuned. All right, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing so much about your work. I know it's rather huge and expansive. I just wanted to close things out. As I mentioned before, I work on IFTF Vantage, or organizational program. So it's this organizational counterpoint to Foresight Essentials. We offer research-based perspectives, a collaborative digital platform. So much to Rachel's point about having space for people to come together to ask these questions, to learn about what's being done before, as well as a more customized coaching through our Foresight Guides, our annual Immersive Summit, the 10-year Forecast Summit, and Future Factors, our signals database, which will debut next quarter. So a place to collect all of these emerging technologies and disruptions that all of you might be coming across. So if you're interested in our organizational partnership program, please feel free to email me. There's my contact information there. If you would like to follow up with Rachel with any, like as she said before, ways that you see that the World Bank could be doing things differently, questions that you might have after this Foresight Talk session, please feel free to email her at the address that you see on the screen. Again, this webinar recording will be available on the Foresight Talks webpage in 1 week, and we have another Foresight Talks webinar with Dr. Renee Warbeck, which will be very exciting, I'm sure, if you've read any of his academic research on corporate foresight. So you can join us for that on March 12th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And with that, just again, thank you, Rachel, for joining us. This is really a great conversation. It's exciting just hearing just about the amazing work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much to all of our very, very patient participants. And again, thank you to my colleagues who are also on the call. It is a very big team effort. So I'd like to recognize how many different team members contribute to this every day. So thank you very much.
All right, and well, that will close, and I hope that everyone has a great day. Thank you.